This is the fourth video on our ongoing discussion on the topic of the Old Testament canon. We have been looking into this discussion because you may be aware that different Christian traditions holds to different number of books when it comes to Old Testament. Essentially, throughout the history, different traditions, like I mentioned earlier, accusing each other for adding to the books. That is the Protestant claim, accusing the tradition of Catholic and Orthodox that they have added multiple books for their own reasons, or political reasons, or theological reasons, whatever that might be, and vice versa. And those traditions accusing the Protestant for removing those books. And this can be very confusing, especially for a new believer acquiring to the faith, and now they face these roadblocks like, which direction should I go? Now, what we've been doing on this talk here is to discuss the nature of those books and see if it makes sense to hold to the 39 divinely inspired books as the Protestant, or you can be open to Catholic or the Eastern Orthodox canon when it comes to the Old Testament. Now, my presupposition as a Protestant is that there should only be 39 divinely inspired books when it comes to the Old Testament. Now, one may say, well, that's your bias. You are only going by your own tradition. Well, friends, I really want to be very clear that when it came to this topic, it was very disturbing, and I really spent a lot of time in reading and listening and trying to get to the truth, because if there should be more than 39, it makes sense to follow all of those extra books, because we might be missing out when it comes to the matter of our theology and faith. So it's very important that we take this discussion very seriously. So upon my research and putting some presupposition tests or appeals, it becomes very clear to me that there should only be 39 divinely inspired books when it comes to the Old Testament. So I've been discussing that in our previous three videos. We made about three appeals. I'm quickly going to recap those. And if you haven't watched those previous video, you are more than free to go into our channel, whether on YouTube or Facebook, so that you can get yourself caught up. Our first appeal will look at those books if they do claim to be divinely inspired by themselves. And the criteria that we put in place was to examine whether the book was written by a prophet, was it authenticated by another prophet. But here is the golden rule that we mostly apply: was the book holding to the Mosaic law? Essentially, anybody that came after Moses as a prophet, they only had one job, and the job was to make sure that they bring people back to the law. So Moses was the golden standard when it came to our first criteria. The second thing we look at, or the second appeal, was what was Jesus Christ's view of the Old Testament canon? Was he open to multiple books, or was he really tied down to a different, a certain amount of books? And when we examined that, we found out that Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, only appealed to 22 books. You might be confused, like, well, you say 22 books. Well, that is the Hebrew canon. So what they've done is they grouped certain books together, like First Samuel and Second Samuel. That's one book. In some cases, they even make it one book, including First, Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and combining all those books together. So when you break those books separately, it will amount to 39 books. So Jesus Christ appealed to the 39 divinely inspired books. The last video we discussed, it was the view of the Jews, since the whole oracle of God was given to the Jews according to Romans chapter 3. So we appealed to the Jews, mainly to the Jewish historian. We looked into some writings of the famous Jewish historian Josephus, and this man had access to all the scrolls of the Old Testament books when Rome invaded Jerusalem and trying to put down the riots that was going on in Jerusalem in 70 AD. He had access to all the books, and this man is only reporting 39 divinely inspired books. And we look at another Jewish historian that preceded Josephus, that was Philo. He was actually before Jesus Christ, and some hint in his writing, and we found out that he appealed to the law, the prophet, and psalms or hymns, and those are the reckoning of the Jewish books. In today's video, we are coming to wrap this session up. We are going to look into the early Christians. What was their thought when it comes to the Old Testament? Like we ended in our last video, we said it very clear that when it comes to the early Christian, also known as church father, I may be using that term, but I'm not too confident or really feeling at ease using this term church father, because they did not birth the church birthed them. But nonetheless, their opinions or their writings does help us a lot to understand the nature of the early church. So the fair warning is that when it comes to the church father, they were not unanimous when it comes to the Old Testament canon. It's very, very complicated when it comes to the to the early Christians, or also known as church father. So I might be using church father just to make it much easier for anybody else that is familiar with this lingo. So I will be using that. So when it comes to these people, the Protestants like to appeal to them, and so is the Eastern Orthodox or the Catholic. You will find out that certain church fathers, that both sides or all three sides, whether you are from the West or from the East, you will find out that they all value these church fathers, but each of them do have different canon. Now, the point here is that one thing that you will notice is that even though there is a disagreement or different rendering of this canon, one thing that remains the same is that they will always appeal, the 39 books will always be included in those canon. So without further ado, let's talk about these church fathers, if you will. So what I'm doing here, I'm not appealing to each and every one of them. There is so many. What I have done is I have selected only few, and I consider this to be the greatest scholars or theologians that we can learn more from. And I have excluded Augustine. Please don't attack me. I think Augustine is a brilliant man, but I have excluded him because of this reason. He did not know Hebrews. He didn't know, he wasn't well versed in Hebrews, and he was really very much involved when it comes to the canon. So the Eastern fathers were more favored because they were from the East, and they were more knowledgeable and knowing what was going on there. So if Augustine doesn't make it to the list, it doesn't mean that he's not that important. I value his work. He's an incredible person. So let's get into it. So the first person that I want to talk about here is Marcion. So Marcion of Sinope. So, let me just tell you a little bit of early church history here. When the churches were made, we did not have the Bible like we have today. There was no need for it outside of the Old Testament canon that was already in place. There were just writings passing along to different churches. You will see certain churches have more writings of Paul, and some did not. And when you read the last chapter of the book of Colossians, you will see Paul asking the people of Colossae to read the epistle that was written to the church of Laodicea. And that was just the nature. So when it came to the Old Testament, the idea here was when church or Christian were confronted by heresy, and that was the main reason that started this whole idea of coming up with the canon. And because there were so many forgeries and false writings and circulating around, and it was very necessary for Christians to identify the books that were supposed to make the cut in their canon. And that's how the whole thing started. So I started talking about Marcion because Marcion was the first person that brought this heresy. Essentially, the heresy of Marcion was, he said that the God of the Old Testament is not the same as the God of the New Testament. So the God of the Old Testament is a very bad God, is not a loving God. And the good God is the God of the New Testament. And what he's done is he rejected wholesale. He didn't have nothing to do with the Old Testament canon. And what is very ironic about this man is that he grew up in a Christian household. His father was a bishop himself. And, I just want to take this time to tell you that, guys, not just because you are born in a Christian home or because you are raising your children going to church, it doesn't necessarily makes them Christian. And if you read church history, you'll find out this is where most of the heresy came from. So to be a Christian, it's something that someone has to make that decision on their own. That's why I'm very critical to my Catholic friends, for instance, when it comes to baptizing children and they are saved. That's the initial of salvation. It's very critical for me when I read a church history and I try to understand this thing and how all of this heresy came. So let's get back to it. So what Marcion has done, he rejected all the books, and even in the books of the Old Testament, he selected the books that he wanted. This is his canon. His canon was the gospel according to Luke. So he liked to Luke. Luke was a Gentile, and what he did, he rejected the gospel of John, he rejected the gospel of Matthew, and so the gospel of Mark. And the gospel that he accepted when it comes to the gospel of Luke, he edited. He removed all the Old Testament quotation that he didn't agree with, so he removed all of those. Upon the writings of Paul, here are the writings that he accepted: Galatians, First and Second Corinthians, Romans, First and Second Thessalonians, Ephesians. He used to call it Laodiceans epistles, Colossians and Philemon, and Philippians. What is done again with those books, he edited out all the things or all the quotations pertaining the Old Testament. So he decided to make his own Bible. And because of this, Christians were forced to discern, to recognize the divinely inspired books. And here comes our very first canon. Now, I did not include the Muratorian canon here because we are not discussing the topic of the New Testament, but that was the first canon that we had access to. That was in about 170 AD. That is nearly the end of the second century. But around the same time, in 170 AD, a man named Melito of Sardis, he was a bishop of the church of Sardis. And if you have read the book of Revelations, Sardis is one of the 7 churches that Jesus Christ John wrote to. So that's how we started. So most of the story that we learn history of the church is by this man Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius of Caesarea was a bishop of Caesarea for sure, and most of the church history, he is the guy that recorded the history of the church. And we know about Melito of Sardis through these men. So here's what Melito wrote. I just want to have the writings here, do some readings so that you understand the context that led to him going and coming up with those divinely inspired books when it came to the Old Testament. So he was writing to his brother Onesimus. So let me just read it for you. Melito to his brother Onesimus, greeting. Since you have often, in your zeal for the word, expressed a wish to have extracts made from the law and the prophets, and that's the lingo we have been accustomed ourselves when discussing about the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, all Psalms included, concerning the Savior, that's Jesus Christ, and concerning our entire faith, and have also desire to have an accurate statement of the ancient books. So this is the main reason Melito is writing to Onesimus. Onesimus needed to know about these books because the crisis is there. You have a heretic like Marcion running around, and this man is one of the most arrogant heretic you never met. I was reading in one of the writings his encounter with Polycarp. Polycarp was a bishop, and he was a disciple of Apostle John. And when he was arrested and made it his way to Rome to be executed, and he met this man Marcion. So Marcion walked up to Polycarp and goes like, "Do you know who I am?" Well, here is the funny response of Polycarp. "Yeah, I know who you are. You are the firstborn of Satan." Yes, that's what Polycarp says about Marcion. So Marcion wasn't just a guy that was very slow. He was gaining popularity. Until today, quite frankly, most people have issues when it comes to the Old Testament. You barely see churches nowadays opening up Old Testament book and going and studying it. They just try to avoid it. Even as a child growing up, and I kept the same belief for a while, the idea that, well, the God of the New Testament, he's a really good God. If it was a God of the Old Testament, he would have struck all of us dead. I didn't quite understand the mercy and the graciousness of the God of the Old Testament. He's still the same God because he's one God. So let's back into our readings here. So Melito writing to Onesimus, trying to get the accuracy of the ancient books. Let's get to the list of those books. They say, accordingly, when I went to the east, back to Jerusalem, and reached the place where these things were preached and done, I learned accurately the books of the Old Testament, and I send them to you as written below. So Melito done his homework. He didn't just get the information from a third party. He decided to show up in the crimes scenes, if you will. He showed up where the preaching was done, how the whole things were happening. He showed up there to get the information. And again, keep in mind that this is the very first list of canon we have as Christians outside of the historians that we discussed about in our previous lecture. So here are the list of the books. You see, these are their names of Moses, 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, the 4 kingdom, that is First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, the Psalms of David, Solomon's Proverbs or Wisdom. It's exactly the same, or it didn't say and wisdom, so don't confuse this with the books of wisdoms. So that's not the same. Ecclesiastes, Songs of Song, Job, the prophets. Here's the list: Isaiah, Jeremiah, the 12, so all the minor prophets, all combined together, from which also I have made the extra, dividing them into 6 books. Such are the word of Melito. So here is the first ever recorded canon. So you see an odd book there. I'm not 100% sure. I believe that the wisdom, the book of wisdom, if you will, that is the same as proverb. I don't think it is the book of wisdom. And you also see Esdras. Esdras is the same as Ezra. It doesn't mean the Esdras that you find in Eastern canon, where they have first Esdras and second Esdras and third Esdras. I think if there is a third one, I might be wrong. So that was the list of Melito. So let me just go quickly for the sake of time here, get to other one. I did not intend this video to be that long, but let's quickly get into it. So the second person I wanted to talk to is Surah of Jerusalem. So we're talking about he lived in from from the 300s. That's the beginning of 4th century. And here's what he wrote. So let me just set the context here, the context that he's writing in, so that I am not misquoting this man. He's teaching the people that are acquiring the Christian faith. Today people show up and say, I believe in Christ, and they get baptized. Back in days, for you to be baptized, you actually have to go through a certain type of learning. So you learn about the Christian faith just to make sure that you understand what you are getting yourself into. It wasn't like a free, easy believism that we see today, that all you have to say, I love Jesus, I believe in him, and then you are saved. And disregarding the fact that it's not just confessing Christ as your savior, but also as your Lord. So that's what they used to do. So he's writing here to the new guys. So here's what he says: learn also diligently, and from the church, that applies to the whole churches, what are the books of the Old Testament and what those are the new. So the New Testament books, and pray, read none of the apocrypha writings. For why do you, who know not those which are acknowledged among all, trouble yourselves in vain about those which are disputed? There you have it, friends. Even in the early churches, their discussion about the Apocrypha book, or the Deuterocanonical book as known to the Catholic, it was never a settled issue. It was a debated issue. And you can see that the debate was never about the 39 books. It was always about the extra books. And Cyril is writing here saying that, hey, have nothing to do. I know it's a little bit harsh by saying have nothing to do, but when you look at his canon, he actually included a couple, or if not three, of those books. And he does not say that those books are divinely inspired. He said they are good for devotional, personal devotional, but they are not regarded as the divinely inspired books. So let's see his list here. Those are his list. Pretty much the same thing as the first list. One thing that you may notice here, I forgot to mention in our previous list of Melito, one book that was missing, if you didn't notice, was the book of Esther. He did not include the book of Esther for some reason. So we'll talk about that next time. Cyril here, he has included all the books, and he included two extra books. What do we have here? We have the book of Baruch. So he included the book of Baruch. He also included the epistle, let me see here, of Jeremiah 1, including Baruch. So Jeremiah is along with Baruch, Lamentation, and the epistle of Jeremiah. That's another book. So he included two books. Baruch was a scribe. If you read the book of Jeremiah, this name will appear. He was a scribe of Jeremiah. So for some reason, people thought that, well, he is continuing in the ministry of Jeremiah. So he's not perfect. On one sense, he's saying that reject all the Apocrypha books. They are confusing. And he also added a couple of them. And he added the book of Esther. When we checked the previous canon, we did not see the book of Esther. That's why I say that it is complicated. And this is one of the reasons, I'll tell you one of the reasons I have a problem with relying 100% to the so-called church fathers. I prefer to call them early Christian, but let's go church fathers. So let's bring the next person here and we can wrap up this video here. So here is another person here, very important person, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria. This guy is from Egypt. I have to address this. You guys, you may excuse me here. You know, as an African, being on the streets and preaching the gospel, have encountered people bashing and saying a lot of ridiculous things and saying that as an African, you should never, ever believe in Christianity because Christianity was brought to Africa by quote unquote white people. Well, that's nonsense. Absolutely nonsense. Anybody that has studied a little bit of church history, you'll find some of the most brilliant mind theologians in early church history are actually from African. You might heard of the guy named Tertullian. He's from North Africa. uh, Athanasia, he's from Egypt. A lot of these guys from Alexandria, they're actually from Egypt. Christianity was already in Africa. So that's another story. I digress. So I apologize. Let's get back to it. So this guy is very important. He is the guy that fought for Christianity, and especially when it comes to the doctrine of Trinity. When it came to the idea of the divinity of Jesus Christ, there was an heretic man named Arian was a guy that said that Jesus Christ of Nazareth, he is not God, he's not divine, he was created. And there was a heated debate that led to the first major council, which is known as the Council of Nicaea. We'll talk about that in the future. So this man, Athanasia, all his ministry, he's done one thing: fighting for the faith, defending the divinity of Christ, the Trinity. He's fought Arians until the last breath of his life. So here's his canon. The reason I picked him, he's a brilliant mind. He worked he was a politician, he was a statesman, he was a brilliant theologian, and he's regarded as the most prolific writer, the most prolific um, uh, um, theologian of his time. And here's his books. He started, there are then of Old Testament 22 books. Again, here's the trend: 22 books. It is handed down that this is the number of the letters among the Hebrews. You may recall that in our previous video I discussed about this. And here's his list: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, the four books of Kings, that is Chronicles and First and Second Samuel, and you also have First and Second Kings. He actually divided First and Second Samuel differently. And he has Chronicles, he has Ezra, Nehemiah, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Songs of Songs, Job, and then the 12 prophets, the minor prophets, and you have Isaiah. Then you have Jeremiah with Baruch, you have Lamentation and the Epistle, and Ezekiel. So essentially, he has the same canon as Cyril of Alexandria. And again, let me bring the last person. This is the last theologian that we are going to be discussing about. And if you come from Protestant or Catholic, this man is regarded as one of the most, his nickname literally should be the scholar of scholars. And I'm talking to none other than Jerome. But before I get to Jerome, though, I have one more reading here for Athanasius. Here's what he says. I'm just going to read the red part. But you know what? Let me just read back. In proceeding to make mention of these things, I shall adopt to commend my undertaking the pardon of Luke the evangelist, saying on my own account, for as much as some have taken in end. And he's referring to Luke, that's Luke chapter 1, when Luke was interviewing and doing a careful investigation before he writes his gospel. And he actually interviews all the eyewitnesses. So that's what Athanasia is claiming here. So he says, as much as some have taken in end to reduce into order for themselves the books termed Apocrypha, and to mix them up with the divinely inspired scriptures, concerning which we have been fully persuaded, as they who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered to their fathers. So, and again, he was not in favor of the Apocryphal books. And ironically, there are two of them there, the Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremiah. So it's complicated. That's all I have to say. So here's the last man, Jerome. Now, when talking about Jerome, Jerome was he was a priest, very educated. He spoke three languages, as far as I remember. He spoke Latin, Greek. He even studied Hebrews. So just to spare you some of the story here, let's just get into what he's saying here. So he's writing to Pope Damasus. He wanted to go back and correct some mistake going on when it comes to the writings pertaining the gospel. So here's what he says. If we are to pin our faith to the Latin text, it is for our opponents to tell us which, for there are almost as many forms of text as there are copies. If, on the other hand, we are to glean the truth from a comparison of many, why not go back to the original Greek and correct the mistakes introduced by inaccurate translators and the blundering alterations of confident but ignorant critics, and further, all that has been inserted or changed by the copyists more asleep than awake. I find that very funny that he's kind of mocking the scribes with so many error in the translations. And now keep in mind, as a Christian, I do not hold to the Bible being 100% preserved in its translation. No, I do not hold to that view. We are human being. Anybody that is handwriting, copying something, there is a tendency of error creeping in. But the good thing is we can go back and correct it. So Jerome, what he's saying here is, instead of bothering ourselves with this copy, why can't we do what that need to be done? The right thing to do is to go back and learn from the original language. In this case here, he's writing about the four gospels, and we can apply the same thing to the Hebrew text, and that's exactly what he did. I'm not too concerned about the New Testament here. I'm talking about the Old Testament. So what he's done is he moved to Bethlehem. So he lived in Bethlehem, and it took him about 23 years to complete his translation of the Latin Vulgate, one of the most important work of all time, and they stayed around for over 1,000 years. A lot of copying was done, of translations after translations were done from the work of this man. He is highly regarded. And here's what Jerome has to say here when it came to the Old Testament. So he moved to Bethlehem, he learned the language, and he started translating. And when he had an issue, he went and saw rabbis and inquired them, and he asked questions, what is the meaning of this and stuff like that. And he found out that those books here in in bold, those are the numbers of books when it came to the Old Testament. And this is the most accurate. If you compare his canon to the other people, his canon is the most perfect canon, and that is the canon that the Protestants are following. Exactly 39 books. And then he goes on to say, you see how carried away by my love of scriptures, I have exceeded the limits of a letter. So this goes on to tell you guys, I have put in my soul, my mind, and it took him 23 years to complete this. Not just because he was too busy working on this, but because he also had other things to do. And here's what he has to say about the authority of the Old Testament. He say, read the divine scriptures, the 22 books of the Old Testament, these that have been translated by the 72 interpreters. Now, he's talking about the Septuagint. You know, funny enough, if you look at the Septuagints, you will find out that there are more than 39 books. A lot of extra books were added, first Maccabees and second Maccabees and other books. But he's saying originally, though, there was only 39 books. And he even quoted it here that it was not more than that. Now, to use the Septuagint to say that was the Septuagint says that it is more than 39 books, so we have to go by it. Well, Jerome here is saying that that's not the case. It was only 39 books. And beside, he went back to Hebrews. He thought that if I am to translate something, it makes sense to go back to the original language, because the chance of me getting it right is far better than if I have to use a copy. So what else did Jerome say? So that's the last thing that Jerome said here. He essentially said also that the apocryphal books are encouraged to be read, but they are not to be regarded as divinely inspired books. And as I discussed in our previous video, I will make a separate video that these apocryphal books never claim to be divinely inspired books themselves. They were added to the canon. So there you have it, folks. I apologize. This is longer than I normally do, but I thought that it was very important to recap what we've been studying or learning in our lectures so far. So if you find this any value by any shape or form, may God bless you. If you have any question, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll be glad to interact with you in our comment section. In meantime, God bless you and thank you very much.